Hey, Miguel back here on the CRP. Welcome back, and hopefully you're following this series. And we are talking about our book review of the Gulag Archipelago, taking a long-term approach to it. We've been doing it a couple of chapters at a time. For this one, we're going to tackle chapters 5 through 8 of book 1. So basically, this is part 3 of the Gulag Archipelago book review here at the CRP. I'm really, pumped up about doing it. I'm pumped up about reading these books again for the first time in many years and stuff. I still already have found them very powerful and very insightful, and one of the things, is that I think that it gives us access to, the way the Russian folks think. And, not all of them, obviously. He's not popular with every Russian, but I think he's a powerful author. And, the time he's reviewing here, which is the Stalin gulags and the jails and stuff, is an important and massive time in history, I think. And, the books were rated, very powerfully in the 20th century, one of the most, stirring or forceful books written. In history. And, I think it warrants a review. Even now, it's still powerful. So anyway, to get into it, we're going to get right into the chapter 5, which chapter 5 is First Self, First Love. And, obviously you start talking about the cells. And he was in the, Lubyanka for a while. And, you go back and forth with, some of the buildings that that he was in. And he remembers the Lubyanka in the first cell because of who he had conversations with. And, you've just been arrested. In his case, he just came and, walked into the Lubyanka with his guards and, off he went, was put in a cell. He knew what he was basically charged with, but you get taken right away. He was sharing with a group of people, and, there you start to get the configuration of things, once you're in jail. He figured out early on in the process, there's usually a stool pigeon in there somewhere. And that's a lot of what the Russian system works on, is that you tell on people, and, if you really get into the details of the laws, to not tell on people is also an offense. So, you're in a huge trap there. And, but you find other people, like-minded individuals and stuff and things like that. He also describes at one point, when he leaves his cell to go to the interrogation, it's dark or whatever, but he's counting off footsteps, and he had a system where, he would know whether he was making a left or a right, and he would count, 0 for left, 1, 1, and subtract for the, but basically he had a system so he could recreate the steps and things. And what he wanted to do, and again, this is just the kind of mind he had, was he could identify the window in the cell he was in the prison if he was out as a free person by, laying out the format of the jails. And that's something that, he did at all the locations that he was at that he could. But you always fall in love with that first cell. He also describes, at one point, we're going to get into the next subject, which is that spring, but the next chapter, which is 1945. And, but he says at one point in one of the cells that these guys, written up top, you're in a hopeless land there, right? And written up top above one of the doors, so high that someone would have had to have stood on another man's shoulders. So it took 2 guys to do this, and it wrote Amnesty, spring of 1945. So anyway, let's get into that spring of 1945. The spring, here's the thing, you want to talk about Russian insight. Because as an American, we won World War II, right? I mean, this is almost, that's how we're taught it in history classes. We lost the least soldiers because we were out, we were smart, we were out of the war until we had to get into it. Other people had lost, millions of soldiers prior to us entering the war, kind of thing. We fought on 2 fronts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah. The thing is, the Russians lost, millions upon millions of people, and they see it as their war. And, if the United States had not joined that war, and Britain, had capitulated in some way, and Germany had been able to turn around and fully attack Russia, who knows what would have happened, right? This is just complete speculation, but I don't think your average Russian would have said, "Oh, the Brits are out, the Americans aren't in. We better give up." I think these guys were going to go. They fought one of the most unbelievably tragic and horrifying wars with Germany there already. Now, I think that would have been augmented, but I think nothing in the Russian personality means that they would have given up. I mean, they again, in previous versions, because you're talking about now a communist hardening to Russian pride. I mean, under the czars and stuff, people were more pragmatic here, but to these guys, it meant nothing to send guys to jail or to anything. So when 1945 ended, they were like, our war ended. And Solzhenitsyn describes being in a cell and not knowing that the war ended, but you could hear the bands in Moscow starting to practice, basically. Maybe there were going to be parades, maybe there were parades that he heard and things like that, but he had no info, they only find that out afterwards, that the war was over. So now, again, you're in a hopeless land. The word amnesty had been tossed around. And, it was out there and it was heard. Now, it didn't get done very often, right? And, these things sometimes go wrong and stuff. But, again, he's in jail. He's just been brought in. He hasn't heard his case yet. So he's been taken to interrogation where they're asking him and they're trying to confirm things. And, that's a whole game that we already looked at earlier. And, then at some point you get called in, you're told your sentence, right? So now you're sitting around waiting for a sentence, and the bands are playing in the back and stuff. So now, you kind of get the feeling that maybe the amnesty, at least the hope is starting to head there, right? And, they're coming in, and periodically the guy gets taken out and he comes back, no amnesty, they're starting to look at things, and everybody's starting to overanalyze things, and all of a sudden, they come through one day and they take, our man here, Solzhenitsyn. I've got other better notes on this stuff here too. Hold on a second here. So, the war's over there, and the band's practicing. We got into all that stuff, And so the problem here was that now the way they knew that the war kind of ended at the very end was the flood of prisoners that were Russians, because now all of a sudden, so many Russian prisoners were put into the system here that, who were these guys? There were Russians that worked for the Germans, So there was this whole confusion of people because, the Germans came in, captured half of Russia, and there were people behind the lines that, for whatever reasons, maybe they, had already felt the pressures of communism and Stalin and things, and they didn't like the old system, They went after the intelligentsia and everybody like that, so the religious people, everybody like that. They had no reason to love the Soviet Union. So some people naturally, I think, worked for the Germans. There were people of German descent, perhaps, not many, but, there had to be some. And then, you had just out and out, people trying to just survive, soldiers that were in prison camps and things like that. Yeah, go dig a ditch or something. You know what I mean? The guys in the prison camps, they felt abandoned. The Russians were like, we don't care about your prisoners and we don't care about our prisoners. So do what you want, have at it, So the Russian prisoners were sort of known as being like the lowest tier of prisoners. So it wasn't cool to be a German prisoner, but guess what? Just the prisoners got arrested too. Just, how could you survive? Those you got no help from us. How could you survive? Only by helping the Germans, only by being complicit. These are all assumptions. So the jails were flooded that spring. You know what I mean? And, he runs in, like, for example, he writes, this is his own words, he met a guy who survived Buchenwald, one of the German camps. And this is his own words. How could he have survived in an annihilation camp? Annihilation camp. If you came out of there, you had to be traitorous in some way in order for you to have made it there. So everybody there was a traitor, and he, again, being an author and a man with a mind, he makes a distinction because traitors of the motherland is what these people were called, and in many ways they were her traitors. But what he wants to make sure that is clear is that they were not traitors to the motherland. They never betrayed her. Most of these guys were just swept up in this hideous system and things, and that's the ex-Russian soldiers. They get called back. Some guys were leery about coming back. They were still across the lines and stuff. They were actually, NKVD guys went out and said, the motherland is forgiving you. If you don't come back, you come back. Another refrain that comes back of the prisoners he met, the Russians there, they had only known that they were going to be treated that way, that they may never have come back. And then there's the whole issue of the Vlasov Brigade, or General Vlasov, who, he was in German territory trying to free Leningrad, got no support, got arrested, and basically the Germans put him to work. And, he put together a brigade of Russians that, fought for the Germans and stuff. So now all these guys, man, that, you didn't want to be these guys coming back to Russia there. They were not treated well, right? So the idea of the amnesty, starts to unravel quickly, I think. But, again, they're hanging their hopes on it. And Solzhenitsyn's story progresses here in that him and a handful of other guys that now they've gotten to know each other over a couple of days or whatever, and they know, these guys here, that's serious charges. They took a few of the guys with less serious charges, extenuating circumstances. This isn't a common thinking mind, you know what I mean? And they're like, this might be the amnesty. They're taking a handful, 10 of us at a time. 10 of us are gone. Everybody seems to fit the bill of not being, too threatening or anything like that. They were doing their own analysis. And basically, they get into a room, they're there, and they're waiting around, and the first guy goes out, and he comes back in, and basically they were sentenced. He was sentenced to his 10 years. And Solzhenitsyn goes out. Now, they can't believe it, right? Solzhenitsyn goes out, and he gets in a very detailed description of the communist, office worker there with his, black hair and stuff. And this guy, reading from photocopied or, whatever that stencil type of copy thing that they used to do, the charges and the gate, not saying much, just read this, sign, and there it is, 8 years you signed away and stuff. So the whole amnesty thing was just absolutely a dream. And they got there. Now, after you've been sentenced, now this is where you go off to another camp and things like that. So the previous time he's been waiting to be sentenced, now the sentence comes in, he got 8 years, so he got off light. And, that's the story of that spring with the hope and all the Russians coming back being arrested. Now, in the engine room, the next chapter is a short chapter, but it's a critical one here. Here he describes the OSOs, and basically, these are special units, and that's what, that translates to, right? It was a 3-man team that called the Troika. Now, the Troika, became a feared word kind of thing. And they reviewed the case, looked at it. Maybe they didn't review it. He's of the impression, he talks about it, that systemically, it was like, hey, there were mass arrests over here. Why? Because they had to build a canal over in, the Ural Mountains and things, and they needed workers, and they were going to throw thousands of workers at it. And if some, hundreds of them died, they, go arrest more and fill the shoes, So they had quotas of arrests and things, guilty or not guilty was, in your mind, these guys, you were all going to be guilty. There weren't going to be mistakes or anything like that. So now what the other thing is the Russians had a judicial system, quite a good one, not a good one, I'm not here to judge, right? I don't know to say good, that was the wrong word, but an extensive one, right? Under the czars and things, you had the right of appeal and, things like that. Now, what the OSOs did, and this is why the chapter is called In the Engine Room, this is the trick that allowed the Soviet system to jail millions of people, along with all the intimidation and the way the system worked leading up to the arrest. Once you were in here, how do you absorb all this? Okay, the simple. It's an extrajudicial system, right? So now the courts don't have to deal with any of this. Some of them may have, crossed over and things like that, but you could never deal with a court under, the public gaze or anything like that. The stuff could go on in secret, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in Solzhenitsyn's case, like I said, he finds out this guy's 8 years, and off he goes. But and he says, there's nothing you can do. The guy's there to get your signature, and there's a disclaimer in there that says, he's giving you the read down anyway. If you refuse to sign, you're getting it anyway, and the sentence is going to be passed. There's no one you can ask for. There's no phone call you can make. There's nothing there that's going to help you. Just this bureaucrat waiting to collect your signature. How much trouble are you going to be? Most guys, like we already touched the subject of how he felt sheepish and how people just went along with the system. Those people signed, right? I'll have somewhere else I can stake my case. Obviously not here, right? Somebody, and he notes somebody. One guy may have wrote a protest. In fact, I disagree with this. This is. All my rights have been taken away, whatever you want to put on there, and it's just a stencil. Your charges are way back over there. There's nothing that's going to go away. They'll just rip that up and chalk it up to, La La Land, your resistance or rejection of the proceedings there, And from there, we're going to get more into details of the law. Now, the basics of Chapter 8, and this is where we're going to close out, is that Chapter 8 is called The Law as a Child. Now, with the Russian Revolution in 1918, really the Soviet, what was the Soviet regime and the laws, were in their infancy, if they were there at all. They did a lot of stuff on the fly, a lot of things were like, okay, do it this way, Lenin stated it, or whichever power that be laid it out, and this is the decree, and everybody act, accordingly kind of thing. And then gradually the paperwork and the bureaucracy behind, a judicial system was built, So from 1918 to 1921, you're very much in a Wild West type of territory. And what Solzhenitsyn points out here is that the Soviet entry here, because 1918 is where the Soviet Union is now, an entity there. That Soviet entity is not Russia, right? But now here they are in 1918, and from the very beginning, from Lenin and down, there was an insistence on being harsh. They were not afraid to be harsh. And they felt, a great deal, and Solzhenitsyn points a lot of this out in, subtle ways in the books and stuff, Lenin had been in Germany, where in Germany had been receiving support and things for his ideas and so to speak, now he comes back and he takes over. Now they felt, that the czars were the cruelest of the cruel, that they've been treated hundreds of years, the czars that just dominated the people. And, at this point, you can make a case that the czars, separate of the Soviets who, aren't the Russian people, but the czars were almost no longer Russians. Aleksandr, was the last czar, right? And, we know about how they killed him and his family and stuff. But his wife, wasn't Russian. She didn't speak great Russian, They had an emphasis on things like, learning French. And, at times in the court, in the Russian court, they spoke French. And, that's something that, you can't lose touch of the fact that the czars were way gone in terms of the population. They already so disappointed that they didn't have a lot of friends, right? So, and they were cruel, to a certain extent. They were, they could do whatever they wanted. So, going back for many hundreds of years, the czars had lived, that type of life and things. So they'd already gotten to the last straw with their people, right? So the groundwork was laid for Lenin. But when Lenin, and those guys came in, when the revolution started, they felt they were on their back foot, and they felt that they had to be cruel, so they didn't want to give anybody any chances. And that's a lot of where this comes from. There was a lot of, we touched on the word extrajudicial before, there's a lot of that, summary judgment, boom, shot in the head. Hey, that's the way the early Russian Soviet law enforcement came about. Very harsh, take people in jail, put them in jail, put their families in jail if you have to. They don't need to know what they're charged with. Just hold on to them for a while. all the pressure and all the things that you worry about there, that you can't do. They sort of were like, well, we're going to do it here at the onset of the revolution because, we're at war. The revolution means anything goes. And, so that's where that sort of thing comes up, in the law as a child. So from 1918 to 1921, you had a great deal of, change, metamorphosis that came about in the way things were handled, always leaning towards, harshness, towards, not being forgiving or anything like that. And you're talking about guys with, religious, fervor to their beliefs, in terms of government and stuff like that. So the Law as a Child chapter, it talks about, specifically Krylenko is one of the guys who's a prosecutor. And it just talks about the farcical nature of, a lot of the trials here. But they have got some cases. The case of the Churchman, January 11, 1920. In this case, Krylenko's opinion is going to have a suitable place in the annals of Russian Revolution. Right there in the annals, indeed. It took one day to wring Kosyrev's neck, but in this case, they dragged things out for 5 days. So Kosyrev refers to the other one. This trial lasted for 5 days. The principal defendants were A.D. Samarin, a famous man in Russia, the former chief procurator of the Synod, a man who had tried to liberate the church from the Tsar's yoke, an enemy of Rasputin, whom Rasputin had forced out of office. Kuznetsov, professor of church law at Moscow University, a couple of Moscow archpriests, etc., etc. So, their guilt lay in creating the Moscow Council of United Parishes. So, anti-Soviet group, having meetings and things like that. So these fires went down. And it gives you an insight. They slowly are escalating. It gives you an insight on the intrusiveness. They were ready. They were going to do anything to make the revolution sit. And the groundwork, the foundations of what we were going to get by Stalin was, sort of the fact. It was built already for him. He augmented it in such a way, but if a different approach had been taken in the early going, I think is Solzhenitsyn's message, then maybe Stalin wouldn't even have existed or come to power. Now, he was very cunning, and that thing, but what if Lenin and Trotsky hadn't broken, and maybe Trotsky was, it's all speculation. But the groundwork for what we're going to get here in future chapters and in the rest of this story is set in the Law as a Child from 1918 to 1921, when the laws and the framework for the Russian legal system, for the extrajudicial system, that would be the NKVD and the OSOs and things like that, the foundations were being laid. So we're getting into it. Very heavy books, very heavy reading. His sarcasm, his indignant non-acceptance of the things, it's all, he's a powerful writer. I enjoy him. And, reading is something that, reading a 3-tome book like that maybe isn't for everybody in the 21st century. But if you really want to, are a history buff, so to speak, and are interested in reading something very powerful, I do recommend the Gulag Archipelago. I'm very happy to bring this book review to you. I'm sorry if you think I ramble and stuff, but I do think it's a profound subject, and we'd like to get into it in the next reviews. We're going to chop off a good part of book 1 and try to get into book 2 here as soon as possible. I'm Miguel for the CRP. Please hit like, subscribe, check out the other Gulag Archipelago videos, and you can check out all our fight videos and stuff on the Cage Rage podcast channel. Thanks for listening.